Declaration of Independence, and his father, Matti Peled, fought in the 1948 Israeli War of Independence and was a general in 1967 during the Six-Day War when Israel conquered Gaza, the Golan Heights, the Sinai, and the West Bank. Later, General Peled became a peace activist and a leading proponent of an Israeli dialogue with the PLO. Miko Peled grew up in this highly political insider's milieu. A young patriot, he volunteered for Special Forces Commando Unit in the Israeli Defense Forces, service he later came to regret. The death of his niece, Smedar, aged 12, in a suicide attack in Jerusalem in 1997, was one of the catalysts for the remarkable personal story of this man who sought justice not through revenge, but through understanding. An understanding that transformed his heart and ushered him into a singular life of pro-peace activism, and some say, a risk. Educated in Israel, Japan, and the United States, Miko Peled is an accomplished professional martial arts practitioner. He holds a 6th degree black belt in karate, which he used to teach at his dojo in Southern California until he sold the dojo because he travels now and speaks full-time. Miko Peled authors a blog that is dedicated to creating peace between Israelis and Palestinians, to tearing down Israel's separation wall, and advocating equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians. He has lectured at universities in the United States and elsewhere, and has appeared on numerous radio talk shows. And it's my real absolute delight to welcome Miko Peled to Fort Wayne and to welcome him here to speak to you tonight. Miko?
Thank you, Michael, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's always nice to see a full house when we talk about this issue, because this is a very important issue. And the more people are engaged, the more people know about this, the more we talk about it, the better chances we have of finding a resolution to this issue, to this problem. Let me start by asking a few questions. How many people here are from Israel, Palestine? Is anybody here from there? Okay, good, thank you. Anybody here have family there? Okay, good. Has anybody visited? How many people have actually been there? Oh, quite a few. Okay, great. Okay, thanks. Is there anybody here who can't find it on a map? Don't be shy. That's not, that may happen. Because, when you look at a map, it's really interesting. When you look at a map, you see, especially that region, what you're going to see, right, you're going to see Africa, which is huge. And then we're going to see the Arabian Peninsula, which is huge. And then big countries like Iraq and Syria and Turkey. And then there's a sliver of land right on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, and the name of the country barely fits. So the name is always on the Mediterranean, like covering Cyprus. And whether you call it Palestine or Israel, the name is always, doesn't actually fit the country. And that little sliver of land is the one that we spend all our time talking about and spend all this money sending and so on. So that's an interesting thing, but that's kind of the reality. So if you can't find it on the map, it's nothing to be ashamed of. This is an issue where there's so much misinformation, so many myths, so many versions of the truth, so to speak, that it's sometimes hard to keep track. And there's a lot of confusion. And what's interesting that in this country, the country that pays the most money to Israel, there seems to be the biggest gap in actual knowledge about this issue. People around the world are far more knowledgeable about the issue of Israel and Palestine than Americans seem to be. And again, although Americans pay more money than anybody else to Israel, and perhaps these two things are somehow connected. So it's not surprising that there's confusion. It's not surprising that sometimes people come down on the wrong side of the issue. And I'll give you a couple of examples of how this could be confusing. One is, when we talk about the actual ideology that brought about the state of Israel, which is Zionism. So the early Zionists claimed that Jewish people around the world, this is 100, 120 or so years ago, the Jewish people around the world are all the descendants of the ancient Hebrews who lived in that part of the world some 2,000-3,000 years ago. And because they are the descendants of the ancient Hebrews, they have a right, and the word the Zionist uses, to return to their ancient homeland. Now then, as in today, most Jews didn't live there. So that was, when you look at it from that perspective, you know, an interesting, but perhaps a little crazy of an idea. To bring all the Jews from all over the world back to this ancient homeland because they may or may not be the descendants of the ancient Hebrews. But the early Zionists were very good at what they did. They knew how to convince the powers that be. And today, some 80, 100 years later, it's perfectly acceptable to say that Jews have a right to return to their homeland, to Israel. It's been accepted. Now, when we talk about this right to return in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, this could raise a few questions because there's another right to return that is discussed, although not enough, and that is the right of the Palestinians to return to their homes. In 1948, when Israel was established, close to 1 million Palestinians were forced into exile. Today that number is close to 4 million. So, when the issue of the right of return comes up, Israeli, or people who represent Israel, if it's official or if it's unofficial, the people who speak for Israel, usually are not willing to talk about it. The right of return of the Palestinians has to be kept off the table. For all kinds of reasons, but one of the reasons that comes up quite often is that this happened a long time ago, this is in the past, and we need to look forward. There's no point in dwelling on the past. Mind you, this was 65, 66 years ago. So what do we have? We have a people whose claim to the land is 3,000 years old, telling people, and who, of course, I don't know a single Jew who can trace their roots back to the ancient Hebrews, telling people who still have the keys to their homes and the deeds to their land, and are still alive, many of them, that their claim is too old. So we, the Jewish people, who every Passover lament something that happened by the pharaohs 5,000 years ago, are telling people who were forced to leave 65 years ago that they have to forget. And this is one of those things that has been completely accepted as part of the discourse. This is how the discourse on Israel-Palestine is being conducted. And then there's another issue. There's another thing that comes up a lot. When Israel is criticized, one of the claims that's made quite clearly and by official representatives is that it's anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism. And some people I know, non-Jews, who are afraid to speak out because they don't want to be called anti-Semitism. So, which is an interesting claim. So if you oppose the state of Israel at all, or criticize it to varying degrees, that means you're anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitic is kind of saying racist, really. But what does it mean then if you support the state of Israel? Because if we support the state of Israel, we support a state that we all know, or we should know, holds thousands of political prisoners. We support a state that has different sets of laws for Jews and non-Jews. And we support a state that distributes different amounts of water to Jews and non-Jews. And we support a state that on a regular basis, as a matter of policy, shoots innocent civilians. And that's okay? So which one of these two is racist? Which one of these two is anti-Semitic? And once again, there's a lot of confusion because this doesn't make sense. And this is how the discussion on this issue is taking place, with all of these mixed messages and double standards and confusion. Now, another thing that's often said is that, well, this conflict, these people over there have been killing each other forever, hundreds of years or thousands of years. And that's really a code for saying, you know what, just leave it alone. That's really what it is. Well, it's not true. They haven't been killing each other for hundreds or thousands of years, certainly. And we can pretty much pinpoint the time, if we want to, where this conflict began. And I would argue that on the 29th of November 1947, when the United Nations came about what they call the Partition Resolution, and this is the map of the Partition Resolution, is a good time to start looking at this conflict. Now, what's interesting about this conflict is that, unlike other conflicts where maybe the argument is over nuance or over interpretation of the facts, the argument here is over the actual facts. We have two sets of histories. We have two sets of stories that are diametrically opposed. And quite often people ask for balance. Well, when you have two stories that are diametrically opposed, only one can be true. And by the way, I should have said this when I started, if you came here hoping to hear a balanced presentation, you're going to be sorely disappointed. Because this is not a balanced presentation. This is clearly a one-sided presentation. I don't believe anybody has a balanced presentation on this issue. If you're up there standing and talking about it, you probably have a very clear point of view on this issue. And it's not a balanced issue. And this is one of the reasons. You have two opposing stories, only one can be true. And finding a balance is impossible. So the United Nations, in their wisdom, decided in 1947 that they would partition the land, creating one state for the Jews and one state for the Arabs. And on the face of it, when you think about it, it sounds like a good idea. That's a way to compromise. The problem is that when we look at the details, we see that in 1947 we had close to 1.3 million, 1.5 million Palestinians living there, Palestinian Arabs living in Palestine. We had barely 500,000 Jews living in Palestine. But when the United Nations decided to partition the land, they gave the larger portion, or kind of the bluish-green portion, to the Jewish state, which includes some of the big cities like Jaffa and Haifa and all these very important big Palestinian cities, Arab cities. And the smaller portion to the larger community of Palestinian Arabs. And to this day, people will say, see, this is all the Palestinians' fault because they rejected the partition plan. Who would not reject the partition plan in their place? That the United Nations would come, slice off a portion of your country, the larger portion, and give it to a community of immigrants who literally just came off the boat. This was the generation of my grandparents who came and immigrated, and then my parents who were the first generation Israelis who were actually born there. Of course they rejected it. Who wouldn't reject such an absurd proposition? And then from this point on, you have the two stories that conflict. You have the story that I grew up on as an Israeli that says that the Arabs began a massive attack trying to destroy the small Jewish community. So they rejected the plan and they decided to attack and destroy the small Jewish community. And because we were smarter and because we were faster and because we were stronger and somehow more developed than they are, we were able within 12 months to defeat the Arabs and establish, for the first time in 2,000 years, establish a Jewish state on the land of Israel. Now, I don't know that you can get any more heroic than that. In my own personal case, my father was a young officer then, and he fought in 1948. And I remember the stories about the battles and so on. So this is so historical and so romantic, why would anybody even begin to doubt a story like this? But then again, as we mature, hopefully we take a closer look at the things we learn as we grow up. And a closer look shows us that in 1947, the Zionist militia, the Haganah and so forth, had about 40,000 armed, very well-trained men. Like I said, my father was an officer in that militia. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. There was no Palestinian army. There was no Palestinian fighting force. There was no Palestinian militia. So who attacked? So in 1947, after this plan was rejected, who was it that attacked? We know that other Arab states intervened later on. This was some 6-7 months later. But at that time, who were the Arabs that attacked? There were no Arabs that attacked. As soon as the United Nations resolution accepted this, passed this resolution, the United Nations passed this resolution, the Zionist militia began a massive campaign of terrorizing and destroying and ethnic cleansing that lasted close to 12 months. At the end of that 12-month terrorist attack, countless civilians were killed, and close to 1 million Palestinians were forced to leave their homes. And the Zionist forces conquered almost 80% of the country. Now, it's not so romantic. Some people may think it's right, some people may think it's wrong, but you can't argue with it because now the story makes sense. We have one community that had a well-trained armed force with a with a plan that was well planned out and was executed well, and you have another community of civilians who had no idea this was coming. And now, once again, the story makes sense. I think it's important to take a look. Okay, well, this is what it looked like at the end of the war. The state of Israel was established. Almost 80% of the country was the state of Israel. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip remained outside of the boundaries of the state of Israel. Hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian towns and cities were destroyed, and of course building began for Israeli Jews only. And then Israeli or Jewish immigrants took the homes of Palestinian homes that were not destroyed. But this is really what it looked like. Now there's this claim whether Palestinians did exist, Palestinians didn't exist, whether there was a civilization, was there not a civilization, yes, maybe they existed, but they were nomads, and so on and so forth. This is a picture of the city of Jaffa. The city of Jaffa is now Tel Aviv. This is before 1948. It was a city of some 100, 120,000 people. They had, I don't know, 6 or 8 different newspapers being published. They had theaters, movie theaters, concert halls. Some of the biggest names in the Middle East would perform in Jaffa. They had business and trade and politics and unions, teachers' unions and other trade unions and so on. And this is only one of the cities. Now this city, by the way, in the partition plan was given to Israel. This is a major Arab city, one of the major Arab cities in the Middle East, on the Mediterranean coast. This is Tel Aviv today, pretty much from the same spot. Within a 2-week period, the city of Jaffa was destroyed. Out of 120,000 people, 4,000 were left. The vast majority were forced to leave. 4,000 were left, were put in a ghetto with barbed wired and armed Israeli guards. Over the years, the city of Tel Aviv evolved. In those days, you had Jaffa with a small Jewish community. Today we have Tel Aviv with a small, neglected Palestinian community, which are the remnants of the past. Problem with that is, the Palestinians call it the Nakba, the catastrophe, what happened in 1948. And I remember myself hearing that word for the first time. That somebody would call 1948 this great historic moment, this momentous occasion when the Jewish people once again were able to establish their own state, a catastrophe. I was personally insulted. And then over the years I understood and I realized and I learned about what took place in 1948, and I came to understand what catastrophe means and why it's called a catastrophe. But I think what people often don't realize is the catastrophe began in 1948 and is still going on today. So the results of that transition between a Palestinian Arab state in Jaffa, a city in Jaffa, and Tel Aviv is that the grandchildren of those people that were forced to leave are now in refugee camps like this. You would not dream of seeing something like this in Israel. This is the Nakba. This is the catastrophe, and it's being allowed to continue. Close to 4 million Palestinians living in refugee camps under conditions either like this or similar to this. This particular refugee camp, there is no water, there is no electricity. It was freezing cold when I was there. That's the sewage system. You see it running through the street. No health care. No medicine, things that we take for granted. And this is an hour's drive probably from where their parents came. It might be Jaffa, it might be Abnei in the south, it might be Haifa, who knows. But this is no more than an hour's drive, half an hour's drive maybe. From cities where you wouldn't dream of seeing things like this. You wouldn't dream of seeing things that children don't have water, Israeli children, or food or medicine. Yet this is being allowed to continue to this day, and this is the catastrophe. And this is why it's called the Nakba, and it didn't happen in 48, it began in 48, and under our watch today, this is being allowed to continue. And that is the catastrophe. And this is the result of that catastrophe. This is the result of the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, one of the things that I did in the book, in The General Son, is I went through the history as I found it, and then my own personal family story, and the two are intertwined. My family story is intertwined, like you hear, with the history of the State of Israel. My grandfather signed the Declaration of Independence. Zionism was the air that I breathed, and then, it came to me with my mother's milk. It wasn't something I had to learn, to be a patriot Israeli. And there's a story, it's in the book, that I like to tell, something my mother told me when I was very young, and a story she kept telling me over and over again over the years. It was 1948, she was a young mother living in Jerusalem, and my father was fighting in the front for the cause, for the state, and she was living in Jerusalem, and the Palestinian communities or neighborhoods in Jerusalem, and I don't mean the old city of Jerusalem, I mean Jerusalem outside of the old city, in the western part, what became the Israeli side of Jerusalem. And there are many Palestinian neighborhoods that were there, and in fact, the homes are still intact. The neighborhoods are there, except the Palestinians are gone. When those neighborhoods were taken and the Palestinians were forced to leave, these beautiful homes, which, like I said, are still there, were offered to Israeli families. And my mother, of course, being the wife of an officer and so on, she was offered one of these beautiful homes. And let me say this again, these are beautiful homes, beautiful, distinct Jerusalem homes. And the way my mother tells the story, even to this day, she's 87 and she still lives in Jerusalem. She says, how could I possibly take the home of another family? How could I possibly move into the home of a family, of a mother, where I know the mother has to raise her family now in exile in a refugee camp? And then she goes on to say, and then to see the Israeli forces going in and looting these houses, because these are well-to-do families, these are well-to-do neighborhoods, and taking the rugs, and taking the furniture, and the books, rare books. There's actually a documentary about the theft of rare books and manuscripts. Funny enough, the Haganah had a librarians unit that followed them and went into all the homes and took books. The things we think of sometimes. But anyway, she would see this and she was horrified. How were they not ashamed? And to this day, she will say, they didn't really kick out all these Palestinians, did they? They still have Palestinian families in Katamon or Baka or some of these neighborhoods. She still today feels that sense of shame that we, the Israelis, did something like this. Now the story is a good story, and we all wish that we would have behaved in that way had we been in her situation, 22 years old, with 2 young children, living in her mother's apartment, and saying no to a beautiful house for free. But beyond that, there was something else that the story did that I only came to realize recently as I was working on the book. Because the story bothered me for many, many years. And that is this. Her story, her personal narrative, contradicts the national story, contradicts the national narrative. Because she says we did something wrong. The national narrative says we did nothing wrong. We agreed to the partition. They rejected it. Then they attacked us, and we won. Then we, and this is another part of the Israeli narrative, asked the Palestinians to stay, and they left. And it never happens that I tell the story, and if there's a Palestinian in the room, they always either nod their head or smile at how absurd this is. We, the Israelis, asked them to stay, and they left. So if all this is true, and the homes were just sitting there empty, why not give them to other families? There's no moral dilemma here if the national narrative is true. What she was saying is that the national narrative is not completely true, that we did something very wrong, and she would not participate in that particular thing. And like I say, as I was working on the book, I was able to finally reconcile why this story was so troublesome to me. This is a picture of my father, the general. The book is called The General Son. This is when he was a general. And he remained in the military after the State of Israel was established, became a career officer, and one of that generation of officers who really built and created the Israeli military force, the Israeli army. It's the mid-60s, he was already a general. That whole generation of young officers of 48 were generals in the 60s. They were very young generals, by the way. And the drums of war were beating. It was 1967, and war was on the horizon again. And some of you may recall this, but this was a very tense time in Israel because the Israeli cabinet and the Israeli high command were at odds about whether or not to engage in war. The Egyptian army, the Egyptian President Nasser violated some of the ceasefire agreement, brought forces into Sinai and so on. I won't get into that. It's in the book. These young generals were calling for war. Like I said, they're all in their early 40s. Most of them were born there before the state was established. They fought in 48. They felt very strongly that, they were going to win no matter what. And I mentioned this one particular meeting between the high command of the military and the Israeli cabinet. The Israeli cabinet came to the high command, to army headquarters, not the other way around, which shows you, tells you a lot about the relationship between these two groups. The Israeli cabinet were older, they were all born in Eastern Europe, they had kind of a different mentality. They were these old Jews who carried the Holocaust and all these other memories on their shoulders and were not keen for war. And in those meetings between these two forces, between these two powerhouses, the generals were very forceful, and my father was even more forceful than others, blaming them for being hesitant and saying clearly, without any single doubt, that we were going to be victorious because the Egyptian army, at the time they were only talking about a limited war with Egypt, is not prepared for war. They're advancing an army that is not prepared for war. And we will be victorious whether we attack now or whether we attack later, but it's better to attack now, and they were pushing for war. In the end, as we know, they got the okay, the war took place, they defeated the Egyptian army very quickly, they took the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, and then the generals on their own decided to take the West Bank and the Golan Heights. These were areas that they wanted to take for a very long time. The military was waiting for an opportunity to take the West Bank because they wanted to take the West Bank. They thought the West Bank should be part of the state of Israel. Opportunity presented itself without cabinet approval. Even they took the West Bank and then the Golan Heights. Of course, that has water and strategically placed, and the old city of Jerusalem was in the West Bank. Later on, this story, or actually as was this debate between the two sides were taking place, there was this debate, there was a sense that, or the story came out that Israel was under an existential threat. That we had to attack, that we had to do this because we were under an existential threat. But looking in the Israeli army archives and reading the minutes of the meetings of the generals, not a single word was said about a threat, everything about a terrific opportunity that we need to seize and seize now. And then later on they had to perpetuate the story of the threat, but several of the generals, even Ariel Sharon, all admitted that there was no threat, this was a war of choice. Basically, in 1967, when the war was over, the entire country was in the hands of Israel. The generals congratulated themselves for what they call finishing the job. Finishing what job? Finishing the job of the conquest of Israel. Palestine was erased off the map, and in fact, Israel created a single state over two nations on Palestine, or Israel, however you want to call it. Now people still talk about this idea, one state, two state, as though Israel will allow the Palestinians a state and all this. As soon as the war was over, as soon as the West Bank was taken, Israel did exactly what it did after 1948. Massive destructions of towns and villages and cities. Massive campaign of ethnic cleansing. Hundreds of thousands were forced to leave. And massive building for Israelis only on Palestinian land. It's exactly what they did in 1948, and then they repeated it exactly the same in 1967. The idea that an Israeli government would allow a Palestinian state within these boundaries is either, and anybody who claims that this is possible, is either disingenuous or uninformed. Because that is not something that will happen, and what took place immediately after war demonstrates that. Building settlements, when we say settlements, people think of little villages. Building massive cities, and highways, and shopping malls, and schools. They didn't wait a year, 2 years, 3 years. That began immediately. The building in the West Bank. Immediately. And it goes on to this day. So the problem is not the settlements, the problem is the mindset, the problem is the policy, which builds for Israeli Jews and prefers Israeli Jews all over the country. My father went out, he retired a year after the war, and he became a proponent for Palestinian rights, an advocate for Palestinian rights. On the last day of the war, or I should say not the last day of the war, but the first meetings of the High Command after the war, he stood up and he said this. He said, look, we now have an opportunity to make peace with the Palestinians. We're victorious, we're strong, but there are still two nations living in this land. We now have an opportunity to make peace with the Palestinians on conditions that are more favorable to us. We can allow them to establish a state in the West Bank and Gaza. He had intelligence reports that showed that this was a sentiment among the Palestinian leadership. And if we don't do this, he said, we will become an occupier. There will be resistance to the occupation. The Israeli military will become an occupation force that will have to fight the resistance, and this will have terrible results on the moral fabric of the military and our society. There was not a single settlement yet, not a single suicide bomber yet. And at that point, he split away from the establishment. He stopped drinking the Kool-Aid, if you will. And from that point on, he continued to be an advocate for two things. The rights of Palestinians to establish their own state in the West Bank and Gaza, and the rights of Palestinians who are Israeli citizens to equal rights. Both of these things, or I should say neither one of these things has happened yet. But the second half of his life, he passed away in 1995, the second half of his life he dedicated to accomplishing these two things, and sadly, neither one of them has happened. Now, in the early 70s, mid-70s, he and several other Israelis who felt the same way kind of organized themselves and talked and written. He had a column in one of the Israeli newspapers and so on, and they talked about this need, and they promoted this idea of peace with the Palestinians based on what we know today is called the two-state solution. Immediately after they became organized, again this is the mid-70s, they were contacted by top PLO officials, Yasser Arafat's closest people within the PLO, in order to begin some kind of a discussion on this proposition that the Palestinians would recognize the state of Israel and Israel would allow them to establish a state in the West Bank and Gaza. This was in the mid-70s. They began these, and I described, my father wrote a beautiful article, what it was like to sit there. They met in Paris mostly, and other capitals, and sometimes in North Africa. What it was like to sit there and see the enemy, but this time not on the battlefield. And these were the years where this idea of the two-state solution were formulated, and this was, from a Palestinian perspective, these were official members of the PLO, these were Palestinian officials under the direction of Yasser Arafat. On the Israeli side, these were people who used to hold high position, like my father, but now they're really renegades. And the talks went on and on. They would return, my father would always report back to the Prime Minister, they wouldn't hear of it. In the 80s, Israel actually, the Knesset passed a law under Shimon Peres, Mr. Peace, Shimon Peres, passed a law that made these meetings illegal. They kept meeting, of course, they said, fine, arrest us. And then in 1993, we had the Oslo Peace Accords, which are now, September of 1993. Some 20 years ago. Suddenly, Yitzhak Rabin, of all people, this war horse, the man who was responsible for so many war crimes we couldn't begin to tell them all if we tried, he suddenly became the man of peace, and he suddenly decided to agreed to meet with Arafat and sign the Oslo Peace Accords. And many of us, including myself, thought things are changing. Soviet Union fell, apartheid in South Africa fell, things are changing. In an interview with my father shortly after that, the main headline was, Yitzhak Rabin does not want peace. And people thought, how could he say something like this? This was 1994, 95. He is Mr. Peace now. He shook hands with Arafat. He said, yes, but he read the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords were not an attempt to bring peace. They were an attempt to bring a surrender. By 1993, the conquest of the West Bank was made irreversible. There was no possibility for a creation of a Palestinian state anymore in the West Bank. That is when Israel agreed to meet with the PLO. That is when Israel agreed to finally begin peace talks, because they knew they would lead to nothing. And they were hoping that they could bribe Arafat and his people into surrender, which is why it fell apart. And my father said that. He said, read the Accords. And he, among a few other people, actually read the Oslo Accord, said this is going to lead to disaster. It's not going to lead to peace. Now, the Oslo Accords were supposed to lead to a comprehensive agreement in 5 years. From 93, that would have been 98. It's 2013. It's 20 years. And then I'm sure some of you, maybe all of you recall, in the year 2000, President Clinton brought the parties in, and he said, fine, Camp David, we're going to close the deal. And they all met at Camp David. Arafat came, and the new Israeli Prime Minister came, and Bill Clinton was there, and they sat, and they sat, and they sat, and what happened? They came out after who knows how many days? Nothing. And Bill Clinton in his comments said, well, the Palestinians gave some, but the Israelis gave more. Basically, blaming the failure of the talks on the Palestinians. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to show you something. Look at this map. By agreeing to the two-state solution, by agreeing to creating a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, Yasser Arafat, as leader of the Palestinians, agreed to give up 80% of the Palestinian homeland, of what was Palestine only a few decades before that, and make peace with a very country that destroyed Palestine and forced Palestinians to become refugees, and to forego the right of the refugees to ever return, because Israel is not going to let them return into Israel. And he was blamed for not willing to make concessions. He wouldn't go beyond that, which is what they wanted. They wanted total surrender. They wanted him to go beyond that, and that he wouldn't do. Yasser Arafat was in fact the most consistent voice for peace for 30 years, from the mid-70s until the day he died. He wouldn't go beyond that. I've yet to see an Israeli leader agree to make any of those kinds of concessions. In those 30 years, I hate to tell you how many Israelis were killed because of Israeli government not willing to make concessions. So you can laugh all you want. One thing you cannot talk about the Palestinian issue without speaking about the prisoner issue. Israel holds and has been holding for many years thousands and thousands of political prisoners, of Palestinian prisoners, in its jails in violation of of international law. The vast majority of these prisoners have not been charged with acts of violence. Less than 10% were actually charged with acts of violence. These are not terrorists, these are political prisoners. You will be hard-pressed to find a Palestinian family that does not either have now or had in the past a family member in an Israeli prison. That includes torture, that includes horrific conditions. The Palestinian movement, the Palestinian prisoner movement, is a very significant part of Palestinian society, and it's a very important part in the political life of Palestinians. They have a voice, and they organized themselves, and I talk about the prisoners quite a lot in the book too, as I have many Palestinian friends who were prisoners, about the prisoner movement and about their importance and their contribution. This particular picture is a vigil. I happened to be in Bethlehem, and there was a vigil of mothers who were, holding their children's photos. But I think it's important also to realize that there is a United Nations resolution, and it's up there, and I'll read it to you. It says that the struggle of people under colonial and alien domination and racist regimes, which by Israel's own definition describes Israel, for the implementation of the right to self-determination and independence is legitimate and in full accordance with the principle of international law. The Palestinian resistance is resistance. My father was asked once about Palestinian terrorism. He said, well, when a small nation is occupied by a larger nation, sometimes terrorism is all they have. They are resistance. The resistance is a response to the oppression and the occupation. Thousands and thousands of political prisoners. And yet, they call it a democracy. The story of terrorism and the story of the loss is one that many people over there have. I do too, sadly. My sister's little girl was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. It was September the 4th, 1997. She was, on her way. She was actually shopping with a friend, getting ready for school. She was 13 years old. Now, when something like this happens, I was already living in the U.S. at the time. When something like this happens, you really don't know what to say, you don't know what to think, and you certainly don't know what to do. I describe it in great detail in the book. Basically, I got on the first plane back home to Jerusalem. By the time I reached my sister's apartment, it was already packed with mourners and with reporters, because this was big news. It's always big news, but this time this was the granddaughter of a famous Israeli general, and not only was he a famous Israeli general, he was Mr. Peace with Palestine. He advocated peace with these people, and now look what they did to him. This was the mindset. And after the funeral and so on, after my sister had some time to collect herself, she came out, and of course the questions are always the same. Number one, who's responsible? Number two, what about retaliation and revenge and so on? And very calmly she said this. First of all, she said about retaliation. She said, no real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. Killing people in a response for the death of someone, besides being repulsive, is absurd. And she quoted the famous Hebrew poet Bialik, who said that there is no vengeance that's appropriate for the death of a child. Killing more people? Having more mothers bereaved? And as for who's responsible, she said, look, we need to take a look. These two young men that killed my daughter and took their own lives, what brought to them to this level of despair, of hopelessness that they would do this? She says, when we take away people's land and destroy their homes, when we incarcerate their fathers for indefinite periods of time, when we kill their siblings in the schoolyards, we take away their water, we take away their right to travel, we take away their right to school, we take away their right to work, we give them absolutely no hope at all. This is what happens. And she said, and her husband both said, we hold the Israeli government directly responsible to our daughter's death. Interestingly enough, Netanyahu was prime minister then as well. So now, of course, this became even bigger news, because an Israeli bereaved mother is turning everything upside down. Because we know that the Palestinians don't want peace, and the Israelis do want peace. We know that the Israelis are victims, and the Palestinians are terrorists. Suddenly this bereaved mother is turning everything upside down. And both she and her husband and her remaining 3 boys have become activists, and they refuse to serve in the military, and so on and so forth. And so this became, part of our life. I came back to the U.S., and you don't know what to do. I mean, how can you go back to life? Let me tell you, when you carry a small coffin of a child, it's not something you forget. On the other hand, you have to go back to life. And I was very fortunate that in San Diego, I was able to engage with a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group. And for the first time, I met Palestinians. I mean, I grew up in Jerusalem, which is supposed to be a mixed city, but it's a very segregated, racist city, so Israelis don't meet Palestinians. It was the first time I met Palestinians, and it was also the first time I was in a room or in the same place with Palestinians, and we were equal. The laws that applied to me applied to them. That doesn't happen over there. The laws are not the same. They might need a permit, or they have a checkpoint to cross, or there's a curfew, or whatever the case may be. The laws are not equal over there. Here suddenly I was sitting with Palestinians, and we were equal. And then I began hearing all these stories about the catastrophe, about 48, and so on and so forth, and it was they were very, very generous in their willingness to kind of take me by the hand and very carefully take me through this very painful process. But first of all, realizing that there's another side to the story, and perhaps it's just as valid. And then actually realizing that 2 stories are opposed, so only one can be true. And then to that final step, realizing that the story that I learned was not true. And that is, let me tell you, a very, very painful process. It's like having an arm sewn off without anesthesia. And with my Zionist heritage and patriotism and everything, this is not an easy process. And I'm sure that many of you tonight here who might be supporters of the State of Israel feel the difficulty in hearing the words that I have to say, the things that I say about Israel. And then I began traveling into the West Bank, and I began traveling into Palestinian cities and kind of learning and educating myself, and so forth. Now, the question remains, and this is kind of the last thing I want to touch on tonight, the question remains is, where do we go from here? Like I said earlier, in 1967, Israel created a single binational state over the entire country with exclusive rights for Israeli Jews. A state that I would argue is not Jewish because half the population is not Jewish. You have about 6.5 million Israelis and about 6 million Palestinians living within these boundaries, all governed by the state of Israel to one degree or another. So it's not a Jewish state because half the population is not Jewish. It's also not a democracy because only half the population is counted. So we have a single state over the entire country that's neither democratic nor Jewish but prefers Jews. And this is an option that can go on forever. In other words, in terms of, if we talk about Zionism, if we talk about the state of mind and the thinking of Israeli policymakers and so on, this is how it's going to be. People laugh at Kerry for his attempts to bring back these negotiations. I mean, people laugh at him in Israel. Government officials, cabinet secretaries, they make jokes about him. All right, he wants to start this thing again, fine. We all know there's never going to be a Palestinian state because we will never allow one. They say it clearly. So one option is to remain the way it is. A single state, a racist state, that has different laws for Israeli Jews like myself that are completely democratic. Different laws for Palestinians who are citizens of the state, and there are dozens and dozens of laws that discriminate specifically against those citizens. And they live in complete neglect by the state. Palestinian communities in Israel are completely neglected. Not a single dollar was been invested or a single permit was given to build anything in close to 70 years since Israel was established. And you've got the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza who have no rights at all. They're at the mercy of the Israeli military that has no mercy. And this might be hard for some of you to hear, but I would argue that the Israeli military today is probably one of the best funded, best armed, certainly best fed terrorist organizations in the world. Because their aim is to terrorize the Palestinian people.
No.
And if we need an example over the last 65 years, there are plenty of examples, but probably the most striking example was the attack on Gaza that began at the end of December 27, 2008, and went on for 3 weeks. The attack began on the first day with over 100 tons of bombs being dropped on Gaza. A 1-ton bomb will destroy a city block on the first day of a 3-week attack. 100 tons of bombs on the first day of a 3-week attack in an area where people have nowhere to go, an area that has no air defenses, an area that has never had a military force. And after days and days and days of carpet bombing, they brought in the ground forces. And I remember members of the Jewish community in San Diego dancing around when this was happening and celebrating as Palestinians were burying their children, and dancing and celebrating as Palestinian children were being burned by white phosphorus. That's why I say it's a question of values, it's not a question of politics. But the fact remains that this is the state of Israel, and if you support the state of Israel, it's a package deal. You support a state that has thousands of political prisoners, has an army that terrorizes an entire civilian population, and has different laws for Jews and non-Jews. And if that's what we feel we support, if somebody wants to support that, that's their set of values. That's their set of values. That's the way it is. Some people believe that people of dark skin are lesser human. That's their set of values. But that's the reality. The other option is this. There is another option. And I think the other option is better for everyone, and I think it's inevitable too. And that is transforming this racist state into a real democracy. A state that respects the human rights and the civil rights of all people who live within it, regardless of whether they're Jewish or not, regardless of whether they're Arab or not. A state where Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace, at last, as equal. Now, I don't recall whites in South Africa being happy about apartheid falling, so I don't think Israelis are going to be happy about this possibility. But one day they will wake up and they will see that this is the reality. Because the transformation of a state that is not democratic into democracy is really the first step of leading and creating a normalcy for Israelis and Palestinians. And if you've been there, as many of you have, you've seen it's a beautiful country. It's a country with a lot of potential. We have two societies that are highly educated, large middle class, with more or less a solid traditions of democracy that are willing and ready to move forward and have a lot of potential. The missing key and the key that will move them forward, the missing key and the key that will move them forward is equal rights, respect for civil rights and human rights of all people. And then we will see that people, Israelis and Palestinians, thrive and see that potential for a wonderful future materialize. Thank you very much.